Traditional ecological knowledge represents the collective knowledge of all the people from a tribal area. That knowledge, the collective knowledge, has come through generations over time, and it's recorded in stories. It's recorded in the landscape as you look at it, and you learn to read the landscape and understand the landscape through that knowledge of place. And it's so in that sense, then it's place-based knowledge that's specific to a specific region.
Traditional ecological knowledge is the foreigner's term. We just call it elder knowledge, or just the stuff we know. It's tradition. Actually, it would probably be the closest term, because for us, it's not segregated, siloed, compartmentalized like contemporary foreigner science. It's all together. They're all interconnected. So to us, it's all tradition.
Traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, as we know it, has an interesting definition because it can mean so many different things. It's different depending on the tribe, the location, the type of work or land management projects that are going on. Currently, tribes are sitting down and coming up with definition as we speak.
TEK is traditional ecological knowledge, and in my own words, what it has come to, in my experience here in Chico, is that what I'm doing is actually looking at the skill set of our indigenous ancestors and still of today as a technology that is vital for understanding the sustainability of our land and its resources.
Foreigners came and did their best to eradicate that knowledge, and we're, varying degrees successful, unfortunately. But there were some people who were smart enough, elders who were smart enough to somehow convey it to other people who archived it. There is some knowledge that came through, so we're kind of piecing that jigsaw puzzle back together.
100 years ago, tribes were told they couldn't manage land the way that they had been doing it for thousands of years. They were told it was wrong. A European idea of how land should be managed was introduced into America, and up until just recently, it was thought that was the way to do it.
Miners and settlers that came to this area and dredged and unearthed a bunch of gravel and changed the landscape, that had it been a more reciprocal type of relationship between the settlers and the land, perhaps it would have worked out to a balance. Instead, a lot of settlers came to this area, many got rich, others struck out, so to say, and the land suffered for it.
The traditional resources have been reduced so much. You can throw out numbers, 1% of the original grasslands. The whole Central Valley used to be carpeted with wildflowers. John Muir talks about 400 miles of wildflowers throughout the whole valley, which we don't, it's all farmland, agricultural now. The riparian area is 2%. We built dams everywhere. So we don't have the flooding we used to have. We don't have the vast riparian stretches of that rich ecosystem next to the creek.
The violence that's really happening is truly happening now, of extractions, drillings, mining, of peripheral tunnels being put into our rivers. That is a very violent action against our ecological community.
Tribal people have always felt this connection to the land, and when that was severed, or all the actions that keep them from doing it, it's had an adverse effect on people, and we've seen it in the history of Native people.
If you look at what's happened to the indigenous community, there's high rates of suicide, alcoholism, depression. There's some very negative impact results because of being removed from the land and being forced into assimilation. I began to really advocate for TEK as a subtle, not direct, suggestion to depression and suicide is that it is an earth relation. It's a relationship to the earth. And TEK is a great way of advocating that relationship. Traditional ecological knowledge promotes the self to be involved with the community of the environment.
That relationship for us and for most Native people in California is because we all came from this place. We're the very stuff of the earth. And our stories tell us that we're not separate from that. That's a huge distinction between us and the newcomers, is that they believe they're above it and somehow separate, and so it gives them the right to dominate it, own it, do whatever they want to it. And our stories tell us we're a part of it, and actually we're at the end of the line. For us, it's you're last, you're youngest, so you owe thanks to everybody that came before you that created this place that's a gift for you, that feeds you, provides you sustenance. So you need to be thankful and respect all the others that came before you, because they're all your elders.
I used to read those stories about, the Native Americans, how they knew how to get places, take a right at the bent tree and, the funny looking rock and all that. And I never really understood that until, I really developed this relationship with Bidwell Park. And now, I know the park like that. So it's really a special thing to have that kind of relationship with the land and the place that you live.
The best way to learn about how to raise plants in California then was to ask the question, what did the Indians do? Because they've lived here for thousands of years and made their living from a relatively small area. They weren't like the Plains Indians that rode horses and chased buffalo for thousands of miles. The California Indians lived in a very localized area. So they managed to extract from their 10-mile village site then all the necessary materials for surviving and to develop a culture, to develop an art, to develop crafts, language, music, you name it. They did that all right here, and we can certainly learn a little about how to sustain our life and make it a better life if we pay attention to some of the things they did.
The practitioners on the ground were really doing science. They were practicing principles of application and understanding, okay, if I do this, then this is the outcome. Then if I do this again, I get the same outcome. Then that becomes part of practice.
How much experimentation there must have been to get to the point where you knew which plants were the best plants for poison oak. The gum plant worked best for poison oak, and we still sell that stuff in pharmacies. So it's valid. It's a valid thing that is still useful to us.
A little worm causes malaria. We call it a protozoan, but nevertheless, it's nothing more than a little creepy crawly worm. And one of the traditional uses of this plant that goes back thousands of years is to cure malaria. And in fact, today, when you take a medicine for malaria, frequently it's been extracted from this plant.
This is manzanita. The leaves can be used to make a tea. The tea used with the leaves is used to treat poison oak. A more tasty drink would be boiled from the berries that look like little apples. And these actually are green now, but they turn red. And when they're red, they're sweeter. And so the natives actually use these. They dry out on the stem, and they can be ground up into like a sugar or a sweetener, but also they can be boiled into a tea or an apple cider of sorts. This is milkweed, also known as Indian milkweed. It is probably best known for its use to make cordage. The stalk is really thick, and when it's pulled, it can create fibers that can be woven into cordage, and it provides really strong cordage. Another use for it, though, is that it has milkiness to it, and that can be used to treat sores and wounds.
Willow has medicinal purpose. Willow also has asparellus in it, which is a derivative of aspirin. So you'll find that you can get a medicinal use out of the willow bark. And during the springtime, you could actually, and the summer, strip away the top outside of a larger piece of willow and tie the inside of the bark on the side of your leg to relieve a headache and to kind of bring down your body temperature. There was actually an understanding of how much was in the environment and what was there. It's not so much plant life, but animal life, tracking, hunting, the whole spectrum of what's going on in the environment was specific to traditional ecological knowledge. So it doesn't just have to do with plant medicine.
With traditional ecological knowledge, there's a general interest of maintaining that knowledge, but then also bringing it together with the scientific methodology to fortify that knowledge, not necessarily to validate it, but to just fortify it and give additional set of methodology to the practices on the land. And ultimately this all comes back into adaptive management, where things are applied, looked at, reassessed, adjusted as needed, and then move forward.
When you have ethnocentric scientists who believe that technology is only from space technology, when they're only looking at it as far as computer technology, engineering technology, from a very sci-fi point of view, you completely miss the perspective of traditional ecological knowledge, and that is actually a built-in technology. I'm teaching kids the skill sets, the native skill sets, so that they understand that they're not primitive or undeveloped, but that they're actually a technology that's applicable today, and probably a good foundation to learn how to create sustainable technology in the future.
They would not only harvest the white wood, but they would take the new growth and guide it so that the next year when they came back, they would have a nice stem to harvest. But they would take these stems and clean them up and then extract the fibers from them and use them in their basketry.
So the technology of the basket and the willow, it's not so much in the weave as well, but it's also in the gathering of the willow and how you cut the willow and how you keep the willow patch kind of going. And the idea of the willow is that usually what willows do underground is kind of hold the ground in a way for anti-erosion. So willow is really good along the banks. It keeps the erosion line good. So there's a process of mutual benefit of cutting the willow so the roots of the willow are strong to take the erosion portion, and then you cut the tops as you make your own baskets. So there's that mutual benefit that goes back and forth.
The point is that they're doing adaptive management, and that's a new concept in science, relatively, but that's what traditional ecological knowledge has involved for such a long time.
The Indians managed these plants. They didn't just go out in the wild and pick anything. Quite the contrary. They worked hard and worked from dawn to dark then, managing the plants.
So you can argue on and on about why we should preserve a place, why we should preserve a particular resource. But I don't think people Most people are convinced by those arguments. I mean, maybe they're convinced intellectually, but unless people actually feel something for that resource, unless they feel something for nature and for a specific place or a specific thing, that they're not really going to do much about it.
There's a way of perceiving the environment that changes the way you perceive yourself. And I encourage everyone to look at the environment in different and complex ways. Taking a bus downtown and looking out the window at the sidewalks and the streets, I know that at one time there was a creek, there was a tree, there was a place there that was more organic and less man-made, less concrete. And I look at the creek and I look at the organic matter as the realness of the area. And the dominance that we have over, with urban sprawl, with our cities, it saddens, it breaks my heart. And the only way, I think, that we can't tear down what's already exists, but what we have left, what is left, what we see around us, the beautiful ferns, the tall trees, the beautiful coast that we have in Northern California, they need to be taken care of and tended. And we have to listen to the indigenous voices in this area that care, and I can't give up, no matter what. There's got to be a voice from the past that cares, that can see what happened and then fights.
In terms of obstacles of implementation of traditional ecological knowledge, I think the biggest obstacle that exists for a lot of the land-based and even sea-based management is really linked to policy.
And then, of course, there's access issues on private land or public land.
And if you could really take away the ego and take away a lot of the entitlement that U.S. citizenship seems to give a lot of citizens to land and to resources, and gently understand, humbly understand that you are guests at an indigenous land base.
That intimate connection, we came from the bush, we came from the ground. That really defines us, and everything we have. We were just talking about that the other day within our community, that the language itself comes from the ground, because as we came into the world, we had to interact with it. We talked about what this place was that we had come into, and so we had to figure out how to do that, and we formed words. We created words and then language to describe that, and that formed the basis of everything else that came after it: culture, science, relationships, everything else.
Not only was the concept, the ideas of how to manage the land and take care of it in a traditional way, but there's a spiritual side, and there's a real importance to that. When you have an elder out there talking to the plants, and it may sound silly to some people, but it really isn't. There's really there's something to it.
We were talking the other day about the Ecological solar project, and it kind of is a glaring example to me of these two different philosophies. And here you have the government, for once, trying to do something that Native people have been doing, trying to connect to the land, trying to take care of the land. But the application of their philosophy almost doesn't allow them to do it in a way that makes sense. Instead of putting solar panels on everybody's house, they're sticking them out in the desert where they have convinced themselves there's nothing there. It's totally barren land. So nobody will care. And then they put it right down on our cultural sites, sacred sites, and our burial sites.
You know, being able to go out and set fires, or to be able to go out and do so many of these different activities, falls under so many regulations, and depending on whose law you want to abide by, be it traditional law or you know, the public laws of the United States or state or local governments, all of those things come into conflict. You know, all of those traditional laws are based on the land, where the laws that the public laws aren't necessarily based on the land. They're based on somebody else's idea of how we should all behave and act in this world.
The green movement symbolizes how the government's always treated us, even though they say we're doing this for your own good. You can benefit too. On the shattered remnants of our culture.
Well, I think that TEK becomes, for me, it's almost like a mutual partnership between the native and the non-native. It's like a mutual understanding. It's a ground that we can both walk up to and have respect for each other.
When we build relationships with agencies and agency people, because agencies are monolithic, but they work because people work within them. So we're not concerned with the agencies. We build relationships with people.
And I feel that, you know, just the close, you know, ground or on the ground working with tribal people, agencies are learning more about how tribes manage land and learning not just the science behind it, but the spiritual side behind it, and they're gaining a respect.
You work with them in a respectful way, and you work with the land in a respectful way, and if they see that, hopefully they'll get it. That will change what they do from the inside. And that's what's gonna, in the long term, is gonna work. Changing it from the bottom up, not from the top down. And it's a long-term thing, and we're gonna have lots of losses along the way.
The advocacy of TEK was to counteract suicide that was going on in Indian country. And not only in Indian country, but, you know, as a personal testimony, my own sense of depression and sense of loss and sense of displacement and wanting not to be here anymore at different times in my life, and thinking of different solutions rather than suicide to get to feeling fulfilled. And so I really began to look at an idea of Indigenous Earth Relations Alliance, that your relationship to the earth is contingent upon your relationship with yourself. And so I experimented with that through basketry and through tending willow and through having a relationship with plants. And their response to me and my response to self seemed to be quite measurable in my personal happiness, my personal sense of well-being.
There's been a lot of talk about regaining our songs, getting our songs back. And, you know, we've lost our we have lost our language in many ways, and we've lost our songs. But in my heart, I feel there's a healing process taking place now where we may be regaining our songs, they're coming back to us. And I believe that tribes being able to have more hands-on work with land management is a way of getting those songs back.
If we work with one another, that knowledge that's there, even in some instances may be fragmented, you know, because of settlement histories and things like that, we can start to rebuild that knowledge and share that knowledge and build better partnerships to build a better future for everybody.
Stewardship is taking care of the land, taking care of those resources so that they'll be there for future generations.
There's been a resurgence of interest then in the way the Indians manage their environment so effectively for many years, and maybe encouraging us to learn how we might remedy some of the awful things we've been doing to the environment.
So you have to go beyond and above the call of duty and create more of a movement that changes the overall policy that exists, that changes the nature of how people act as a whole, collectively.
My belief is that if we do what we're supposed to be doing, people will see that, and those who have the capability within themselves to grasp that, to relate to it somehow, they'll get it, and it'll affect what they're doing. It's about being who you're supposed to be and treating the land how it's supposed to be treated.